is at least some incipient or inchoate vision of justice, that, the least of these among us matters. The different among us matters. Now, of course, I think that the standpoint that is through which these things are viewed is completely tragic and unfulfillable, unable to fulfill the very ends that it seeks to bring about. But the conservatives and free market lovers and all these people very often lament the fact. They say, why is it that this, we call it the left, call it whatever you want, seems to beat us on the moral argument every time, despite the fact that we know that our systems and the ideas that we espouse historically have been shown to be superior to the very values that the so-called left is beating us at. And I think that this does raise the fact that I've been reading Tupy's wonderful coffee table book. I know you had a wonderful conversation with him recently about how much better everything is getting
in absolute terms. Yeah,
in absolute terms. And this is a wonderful. It's a very important book. These are wonderful achievements. We should all rejoice and absolutely face them and be glad for them and the things that they will make possible. But it is also very interesting to note what is not in Tupy. I mean, there's no talk about beauty. There's no talk about architecture. There's no talk about cultural achievement. There's no talk about, let's put it this way, there is no talk about many of the things that are most fundamental to the meaning in human life. And that's not to degrade or denigrate the achievements that are being spoken about there, but it is rather to say that if your metric for human flourishing is, do we have enough to eat, and are we not getting rained on? And you go through these lists of kind of fundamentally material things, all of which are fundamentally important, and not only because they're material, because there's also a spiritual dimension to those things for human beings. But the point I'm making is that
you see the same thing in Steven Pinker's work, like The Blank Slate. I hope I've got this right, because I've read a couple of Pinker's books. But one of the things, so he thinks very much like Tupy thinks, and he wrote The Better Angels of Our Nature, if I remember correctly, as well, showing that human aggression has decreased substantially over the last number of centuries. But all of the qualities of humanity that you describe are they're parsed off near the end of the book into a single chapter, as if they're just secondary side effects of some more profound rationality, let's say. And it's the rationality that's concentrating on material well-being. And I don't have anything against material well-being and the elimination of privation, but there is, and it's interesting that you make that comment about Tupy's work, is that the spiritual dimension, it's like the list of what should be attended to have a meaningful life that I listed at the beginning of our talk. At the end, I capped that off with some attention to be paid for the spiritual or moral or religious element of life to bring everything together. And that narrow focus on material well-being, necessary though it is, does seem to lack there's something in it that's missing, that's absolutely fundamental, that if it's missing, undermines the whole project, or appears to.
Well, I think the bottom line is that there is no deep human realization for any individual outside of understanding her or himself in relation to higher order principles, truths, realities. I mean, that's what human beings are. So that is not to denigrate the necessity of improvement in all these areas that Tupy so brilliantly chronicles. I don't portray myself as somehow anti-Tupy. I'm a huge fan of this. I'm a huge fan of the inclusive institutions that they describe as necessary to human flourishing. But I think it needs to be said that in the most developed places, so-called developed places of the world, skepticism about those inclusive institutions is higher than anywhere else, or at least arguably so. I think it needs to be said that there's nothing in the book about the very disturbing trends of rising suicide, of rising of dopamine addiction, of porn addiction in young men, of course, especially. These are, and I think it needs to be said that many of these things that appear to be a very fundamental malaise of contemporary life are also related to technology. And one of the paradoxes, I think, that I love to ask you about, Jordan, relative to your own work on the individual and human individual realization, is that if on the one hand, human beings are becoming increasingly liberated from, the demands of material necessity. I mean, the amount of time it took to, they bring up brilliantly, to create light, for example, was an immense amount of work. Or